You imagine a scene of perfect warmth. When you think of a Victorian Christmas, your mind likely conjures the sanitized, sugar-spun imagery of a Charles Dickens greeting card. You see a roaring fire, a family gathered in joyous song, the smell of roasting goose, and the soft, comforting glow of a candle against a frosted window pane. You believe that the traditions we hold today, the peace, the light, the unwavering cheer, were perfected in those 19th century drawing rooms. But the data of history suggests a much colder, more unsettling reality. If you were to actually step through time and enter a Victorian parlor on Christmas Eve, you wouldn't find a celebration of light. You would find a congregation huddled against the encroaching dark, obsessed not with the birth of a savior, but with the return of the dead. But here is what is truly fascinating. This wasn't an accident or a grim coincidence of a difficult era. It was a deliberate, ritualistic invitation. The Victorians didn't just tolerate the darkness of midwinter, they courted it. Let me show you how the most festive night of the year was once the most terrifying. You're watching The Mythweaver, where shadows tell the true story. To understand why the Victorians spent their Christmas Eve shivering in terror, we must first strip away the electric lights that plague our modern nights. We have forgotten what true darkness looks like. In the mid-19th century, especially in the sprawling, isolated country estates of rural England, the night was not merely an absence of light, it was a physical weight. When the sun vanished in the late afternoon of December 24th, it felt as though the world itself was dying. The winter solstice had just passed, marking the longest, deepest nights of the year, and in the collective consciousness of the era, the boundary between the living and the dead was stretched dangerously thin. While we associate the thinning of the veil with Halloween, the Victorians placed this supernatural convergence squarely on Christmas Eve. The atmosphere was not one of manic joy, but of somber, superstitious reverence. Death was a constant companion in the Victorian home. It sat at the dinner table in the form of empty chairs. It hung on the walls in post-mortem photography. It was woven into the jewelry of mourning hair. In a society where mortality rates were high and life was fragile, the dead were never truly gone. And on this specific night, the Holy Night, the paradox was struck. The holiness of the evening was believed to be so potent that it agitated the spirits, stirring them from their slumber, compelling them to walk the earth one last time before the new year turned. This is why the fireplace was more than a source of heat. It was the stage for the night's primary entertainment. We have replaced this tradition with feel-good movies and sentimental songs, but the Victorians had a different requirement for their festivities. They required fear. The central tradition of a Victorian Christmas Eve was the telling of ghost stories. This wasn't a fringe activity for the eccentric. It was the heartbeat of the holiday. As the wind howled down the chimneys and the gas lamps hissed and sputtered, casting long, dancing shadows against the velvet wallpaper, families would gather to terrify one another. This tradition of the winter's tale is a lost art, a casualty of our modern obsession with comfort. But consider the psychology of the era. In a time of strict social repression where emotions were buttoned up tight and decorum was paramount, fear was a release valve. The ghost story allowed the Victorians to touch the forbidden. It allowed them to speak of murder, of madness, of the restless souls who refused to stay buried, all under the safe guise of a holiday tradition. It was a controlled adrenaline rush in a stifling world. The famous author Jerome K. Jerome once noted that whenever 5 or 6 English-speaking people met round a fire on Christmas Eve, they started telling each other ghost stories. It was inevitable. It was necessary. But these were not the jump scare stories of modern cinema. They were slow, atmospheric dread builders. They were stories about the consequences of greed, the inescapability of the past, and the vengeance of the wronged. They were cautionary tales wrapped in spectral linens. The very architecture of the Victorian home contributed to this dread. These houses were drafty, filled with unexplained creaks and the settling of timber. When a storyteller paused for effect, the house often filled the silence with a groan of its own, blurring the line between the fiction being spun by the fire and the reality waiting in the hallway. There is a profound irony in how we have sanitized this history. We read A Christmas Carol and focus on the redemption of Scrooge, forgetting that the story begins with a corpse. Jock Thick and Fast was dead.
that is the opening note of the quintessential Christmas tale, a declaration of death. Dickens was not an outlier, he was a reporter of the zeitgeist. He understood that to the Victorian mind, Christmas was the perfect setting for a haunting because the contrast made the terror sharper. A ghost in a graveyard is expected. A ghost at a Christmas feast is a violation. It strikes at the heart of safety. This obsession with the macabre on Christmas Eve was also deeply rooted in the land itself. The Victorians were closer to their agrarian pagan roots than we are. They remembered the Yule, the ancient festival that celebrated the rebirth of the sun, but acknowledged the danger of the winter. In the old folklore, which the Victorians avidly collected and revived, the wild hunt rode across the sky on these long nights, a spectral procession of hounds and hunters gathering souls. To sit by the fire and tell stories of the dead was a form of protective magic.
It was a way of acknowledging the spirits outside, giving them their due attention so they would not feel the need to enter the house and claim it for themselves. The darkness of the season was not something to be ignored with artificial lights. It was something to be navigated. The parlor games played on this night reflected this grim fascination. They weren't merely for amusement, they were acts of divination. Young women would engage in rituals to see the face of their future husband, but the risk was always present that they might instead see a skull, an omen that they would die before the next Christmas. The thrill lay in the gamble. They were playing with fate on the night when fate was most fluid. As the fire burned low and the shadows stretched across the floorboards, the mood would shift from performative fear to genuine unease. The stories would end, but the feeling would remain. You have to understand that for them, the supernatural wasn't a metaphor, it was a neighboring kingdom. And on Christmas Eve, the borders were open. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn, not just to keep out the cold, but to keep out the gaze of whatever might be watching from the garden. The holly and ivy brought indoors were not just decorations, they were ancient symbols of life, used to ward off the spirits of winter death. Every element of the decor, every ritual, every story was a brick in the fortress they built against the night. We look back at them and see a quaint black and white world, stiff and proper. But in truth, their Christmas Eve was a visceral, sensory experience of high drama. It was a night where the air was thick with the scent of pine and coal smoke, where the silence of the snow muffled the world outside, amplifying the beating of one's own heart. They sat in that circle of firelight, the only safe harbor in a world of shadows, and they whispered of the things that terrified them most. They didn't hide from the dark, they invited it to sit with them, poured it a glass of port, and asked it to speak. And speak it did. It began as a whisper, a low murmur that seemed to rise from the floorboards themselves. In the Victorian imagination, the boundary between the living and the dead was never thinner than on the Holy Eve. While the church bells rang to celebrate a birth, the folklore of the hearth was obsessed with return. The stories they told were not the sanitized, moralistic fables we associate with the era today. They were jagged, unresolved narratives of vengeance, premature burial, and the inescapable grip of the past. To understand why they did this, why they huddled together to scare one another witless, we must understand the Victorian relationship with silence. In a world without the constant hum of electricity, the winter silence was absolute, a heavy blanket that pressed against the windows. Filling that silence with the voices of the dead was an act of defiance. The tradition was known as the Winter's Tale, a phrase that Shakespeare used to denote a story of sprites and goblins, fit only for the fireside. But by the mid-19th century, this had evolved into a sophisticated cultural ritual. The most popular periodicals of the day, from All the Year Round to the Illustrated London News, published special Christmas numbers, packed not with nativity scenes, but with hauntings. The archetype was specific: the traveler lost on the moor, the ancestral home with a locked room, the portrait that changed its expression in the firelight. These were not merely stories, they were instructions on how to view the world. They taught the listeners that the material world was fragile, a mere veneer over a spiritual reality that could break through at any moment. When the wind howled down the chimney, shaking the soot loose, it wasn't just weather, it was a soul seeking entry. Consider the legend of the Mistletoe Bough, a ballad that was sung and recited in parlors across Britain on Christmas Eve until it achieved the status of absolute truth. It tells of a young bride, flushed with the excitement of her wedding games, who hides in an old oak chest during a game of hide-and-seek. The lid snaps shut, the spring lock engages, and she is trapped. The guests search, the groom panics, but she is never found. Years pass, the groom grows old and gray, and eventually the chest is opened to reveal a skeleton in a wedding dress. It is a gruesome, claustrophobic image, yet it was a Christmas staple. Why? Because it juxtaposed the height of festive joy with the sudden, irrevocable finality of death. It was a reminder, delivered between sips of mulled wine, that the end comes like a thief in the night. The Victorians didn't want to be comforted. They wanted to be reminded of the stakes. They wanted to feel the thrill of mortality while safe in the warmth of the drawing room. But the engagement with the macabre didn't stop at storytelling. It extended into the very games they played, physical rituals that enacted a dance with danger. The most famous, and perhaps the most visually arresting, was Snapdragon. To the modern observer, this game looks less like a festive pastime and more like a scene from a seance or a witch's sabbath. The lights would be extinguished, plunging the room into darkness. A wide, shallow bowl was placed in the center of the table, filled with raisins and soaked in brandy. A match was struck, and the liquor was ignited, erupting into a low, blue, mesmerizing flame. The object of the game was to plunge one's hand into the fire, snatch a raisin, and eat it while it was still ablaze. The visual effect of Snapdragon was intentionally demonic. The burning brandy cast a spectral, corpse-like pallor on the faces of the players, making the living look like the undead. Hands darted into the blue inferno like souls grasping for redemption or damnation. It was a game of nerve, pain, and adrenaline.
There was a primal thrill in touching fire and consuming it, a symbolic conquering of the hellfire that the preachers warned of on Sunday mornings. Children and adults alike participated, their laughter mixing with the hiss of the flames, creating a soundscape that was equal parts joy and hysteria. It was a controlled flirtation with the infernal, a way to domesticate the terrors of the dark by turning them into a parlor trick. Beyond the parlor walls, the folklore of Christmas Eve took on a more solemn, ancient character. In the rural districts, away from the gas lamps of London, the old beliefs held fast. There was a pervasive legend that at the stroke of midnight on Christmas Eve, the natural order was briefly suspended. It was said that the cattle in the barns would fall to their knees in prayer, and for 1 hour they were granted the power of speech. But this was a miracle with a barbed edge. The folklore also warned that any human who dared to sneak into the stable to listen would be struck dead or deaf for their impiety. The mystery was meant to be respected, not observed. Similarly, the bees, vital to the rural economy and deeply connected to folklore, were said to hum the Psalm of the Nativity at midnight. Keepers would go out to the hives, not to listen, but to drape them in black crepe or sprigs of holly, acknowledging the connection between the buzzing life inside and the spiritual significance of the night. These rituals speak to a worldview where the landscape itself was sentient. The darkness of Christmas Eve wasn't empty, it was pregnant with magic. The Victorians, for all their industrial progress and scientific taxonomy, still harbored a deep, atavistic sense that the earth remembered things they had forgotten. This tension between the industrial and the ancient is what gave the Victorian Christmas its unique flavor. They were building railways and telegraphs, shrinking the world and banishing the shadows with gaslight. Yet on this one night, they deliberately turned back the clock. They sought out the shiver. They required the presence of the ghost to validate the comfort of the home. Without the cold, dead hand scratching at the window, the fire inside didn't burn quite as warm. Without the story of the headless horseman or the spectral mun, the safety of the family circle felt unearned. The uninvited guest was another prevailing theme in these fireside confessions. Stories abounded of the entity that joins the party unnoticed, the extra figure in the quadrille, the face in the mirror that doesn't belong to anyone in the room. These tales tapped into the social anxieties of the age, the fear of the intruder, the outsider, the violation of the domestic sanctum. But in the context of the Holy Eve,
The uninvited guest was often interpreted as an ancestor.
The custom of leaving a place set at the table or the door unlocked was a holdover from pagan solstice traditions where the dead were welcomed back to the warmth of the tribe. The Victorians sanitized this into ghost stories, but the core belief remained. The veil is down. They are here. As the night deepened and the brandy burned low in the Snapdragon Bowl, the mood would often shift from the frantic energy of the game to a heavy, contemplative silence. The fire in the hearth would settle into glowing embers, casting long, distorted shadows that danced on the velvet wallpaper. It was in this witching hour, just before the church bell signaled the arrival of Christmas morning, that the most potent stories were told. These were not the published fictions of Dickens or Le Fanu, but the local legends, the family secrets, the true accounts passed down in whispers. The story of the grandfather who saw a black dog before he died, the nursery that always smelled of violets whenever a child was sick. These personal hauntings cemented the group together. They were shared trauma and shared wonder, woven into a tapestry that excluded the outside world. The psychological utility of this cannot be overstated. By communalizing their fears, they neutralized them. If everyone in the circle is afraid of the same thing, the fear becomes a bond rather than a burden. The darkness of the winter solstice, which in earlier centuries meant a very real threat of starvation and freezing, was transformed by the Victorians into a theater of the mind. They took the raw, chaotic power of nature and death, and they framed it in gold leaf and velvet. They didn't conquer the dark, they curated it. And as the clock ticked toward midnight, the anticipation wasn't just for the gifts or the feast, but for the survival of the night itself. They had looked into the abyss, laughed at it, played games with its fire, and now they waited for the light to return, having paid their tribute to the shadows. But this tribute was not merely theatrical. To the Victorian mind, steeped in a potent blend of Christian piety and persistent pagan superstition, the barrier between the living and the dead did not just thin on Christmas Eve, it became permeable. While the ghost story circle was a safe, controlled engagement with fear, the rituals that followed were far more perilous. They were attempts to pierce the veil directly. You see, beneath the civilized veneer of the parlor game lay a desperate, gnawing hunger to know the unknowable. In an era where consumption could take a child in weeks and cholera could wipe out a street in days, the future was a terrifying void. Christmas Eve, standing at the hinge of the year, was the only moment when the spirits might be compelled to whisper the secrets of survival. This is where the night turned from entertainment to divination. When the elders finished their tales and the brandy was low, the young women of the household would often retreat to the kitchens or the shadowed hallways to perform rites that would terrify a modern observer. They called it the dumb cake, a ritual of silence and dread that dates back to the 17th century, but found a feverish popularity in the mid-19th. The rules were strict and the atmosphere heavy with the promise of supernatural intrusion. 3 or 4 participants would gather in absolute silence. To speak was to break the spell and invite disaster. They would prepare a cake of flour, salt, and water, but the dough had to be kneaded not on a table, but on their own knees, a subversion of domestic order that signaled to the spirits that the laws of the physical world were being suspended. Once the dough was formed, they would mark it with their initials and place it in the oven or on the hearth. Then they opened the doors of the house. They sat in the dark, waiting. The belief was that exactly at midnight, the spirits of their future husbands would enter through the open door and touch the cake marked with the initials of their intended. But the terror of the dumb cake lay in the variation of the legend. It was whispered that if a woman was destined to die unmarried or to die young, no husband would appear. Instead, a coffin would float through the room, or a spectral figure would bring with it the smell of grave dirt. There are recorded accounts in Victorian folklore collections of women fainting from sheer hysteria during this rite, convinced they had seen a death shroud in the doorway rather than a lover. This was not a quaint party trick. It was a game of Russian roulette played with the psyche. The darkness of the kitchen, the open door letting in the freezing winter draft, the ticking clock approaching 12. It was a sensory deprivation tank designed to hallucinate destiny. The obsession with predicting death on Christmas Eve extended back into the warmth of the drawing room as well. As the Yule log burned,
a massive, knotted root of oak or ash chosen specifically for its slow combustion, the shadows it cast were scrutinized with forensic intensity. The Yule log was the spiritual anchor of the Christmas Eve celebration, a direct descendant of the midwinter bonfires lit to call back the sun. But in the Victorian home, it became an oracle. As the flames danced, they cast the shadows of those gathered against the wallpapered walls. It was a common superstition that if someone's shadow appeared without a head, that person would not live to see the next Christmas. Imagine the tension in the room, the surreptitious glances at the wall, the sudden intake of breath if the fire popped and a shadow flickered violently. A trick of the light became a death sentence.
The head of the household would watch the fire with a protector's anxiety, for if the Yule log burned out before the morning bells rang, it was a catastrophic omen of bad luck for the entire house. The ash from this fire was considered holy, often kept in jars to cure toothaches or protect the house from lightning in the coming year. But the fire itself was a living thing that demanded constant vigilance. This hyper-awareness of the supernatural ecology of the home meant that every creak of the floorboard and every behavior of the household animals was laden with meaning. It was widely believed, particularly in the rural districts which fed their folklore into the industrial cities, that at the stroke of midnight on Christmas Eve, all cattle would rise in their stalls and kneel in homage to the Christ child. It paints a serene, pastoral image, one that fits the aesthetic of the Christmas card. However, the legend carried a dark caveat, as all Victorian legends must. No human was permitted to witness this miracle. To intrude upon the private worship of the beasts was an act of hubris punishable by death. There is a recurring tale from the West Country of a farmer, skeptical and proud, who decided to hide in his barn on Christmas Eve to debunk the myth. As the church bells chimed 12, the story goes that he heard the heavy shifting of weight in the straw, but before he could see the oxen kneel, a heavy sleep fell upon him, or in darker versions, he was found the next morning paralyzed, his mind shattered by a sight not meant for human eyes. The message was clear: the magic of Christmas Eve was real, but it was not for you. You may inhabit the night, but you do not own it. Even the flora brought into the house was treated with a mixture of reverence and caution. The mistletoe, now reduced to a coy excuse for a kiss, was then a plant of deep druidic power. It was the golden bough, the parasite that grew between earth and sky, never touching the ground. In the Victorian home, it was hung not just for romance, but as a spectral snare. Its complex, tangled roots were believed to catch demons and restless spirits, tangling them in its mesh before they could disturb the sleeping family. But this protection came with a price. The mistletoe had to be burned on 12th night, or else the spirits trapped within it would be released back into the house. To leave the decorations up past their time was to invite the very darkness you had spent the holiday warding off. This creates a fascinating picture of the Victorian Christmas Eve, a night of siege. The warmth, the food, the games, and the laughter were all taking place inside a fortress. Outside, the old lad, a euphemism for the devil, was prowling. The holy night was a shield, but it was a shield that had to be actively held up by ritual and observance. The reading of ghost stories was the first line of defense, a way to acknowledge the darkness so it wouldn't need to force its way in. But as the night wore on, the defense became more active. Consider the beekeepers of the era. In the deep winter silence of the garden, it was customary to go to the hives at midnight on Christmas Eve. The folklore claimed that the bees would hum the 100th psalm in their sleep. A family member would drape the hives in black crepe if a death had occurred that year, whispering the news to the colony so they wouldn't die of grief. This connection between the insect world, the spirit world, and the domestic sphere highlights how integrated the supernatural was in their daily existence. They lived in a world where everything had a soul, and every soul was listening. As the clock crept closer to the witching hour, the atmosphere in the Victorian home would shift from the boisterous energy of the Fezziwig-style ball to a contemplative, almost vibrating silence. The waits, musicians who traveled from house to house, might be heard in the distance, their melodies drifting through the fog.
But even this music had a ghostly quality, sounding like a choir from the other side. The family would gather, perhaps checking the Yule log one last time, ensuring the doors were bolted against the physical and spiritual cold. In many parishes, specifically in the north of England, the church bell would toll once for every year since the birth of Christ, ending exactly at midnight. But the final toll was known as the devil's knell, signifying the devil's death or his retreat from the world for this one holy day. It was a sound of victory, but also a reminder of the war. Until that bell rang, the night belonged to the ghosts, and so they waited. They watched the mirrors for faces that weren't there. They listened to the wind for voices they recognized. They sat in the glow of a dying fire, surrounded by the invisible architecture of their own superstitions, waiting for the permission to feel safe. But that permission was fragile. Even when the bells finally rang, signaling the retreat of the dark forces, the silence that followed was heavy with implication. The Victorians knew that while the devil might be dead for the night, the dead themselves were restless. It is a mistake to think of the Victorian Christmas strictly in terms of Dickensian warmth, of jolly feasts and benevolent spirits. The reality was far more liminal. The hearth was not just a source of heat, it was a fortress of light built against a universe that was largely cold, dark, and indifferent to human survival. And it was in this high-contrast environment, the blinding brightness of the fire against the absolute blackness of the unlit corners, that the tradition of the Winter's Tale truly festered. These were not the moralizing fables of the nursery. These were stories designed to induce a specific physical reaction, the pleasing terror that validated the safety of the home.
As the wind rattled the sash windows, a sound easily mistaken for a skeletal hand seeking entry, the patriarch or a visiting elder would begin to weave narratives of doom. R. James put pen to paper. These stories existed as oral folklore, mutable and parasitic, feeding on the specific fears of the listeners. They spoke of revenants, corpses that rose not as ethereal spirits, but as physical, walking dead who returned to drain the life from their surviving relatives. They whispered of fetches, the spectral doubles of living people, whose appearance signaled an imminent death. If you saw your own fetch sitting in the chair opposite you on Christmas Eve, you would not live to see the new year. Consider the psychological weight of this ritual. You are gathered in a room where the only light comes from a dying fire and perhaps a few tallow candles, which smell of burning fat. The shadows on the wall are not static. They dance and elongate, mimicking human forms. In this setting, the story of the mistletoe bough was a particular favorite, a legend that perfectly encapsulated the Victorian obsession with the proximity of joy and death. It told of a young bride playing hide-and-seek on her wedding night, Christmas Eve. She hides in an old oak chest in the attic. The heavy lid snaps shut, and the latch locks from the outside. The wedding party searches, but they never find her. The festivities turn to mourning. The years pass, and the groom grows old in sorrow. It is only decades later that the chest is opened to reveal a skeleton in a wedding dress, a grim reminder that even in the midst of the highest celebration, the grave is only inches away. They told this story not to ruin the mood, but to heighten it, to make the warmth of the living feel more precious by contrasting it with the cold dust of the attic. But storytelling was merely a passive engagement with the supernatural. For the braver souls, or perhaps the more foolish ones, Christmas Eve was the most potent night of the year for divination. The veil between the worlds was thin, and while this was dangerous, it offered a unique opportunity to peek at the machinery of fate. These rituals were not the playful parlor games we might imagine today. They were steeped in a genuine dread, performed with trembling hands. One of the most widespread practices involved the hearth fire itself. As the fire burned down to embers, everyone present would carefully smooth out the ashes. Then, each family member would place a designated object, a stone, a nut, or a marked coin, into the hot ash. They would go to bed in silence, for to speak after the ritual was to break the spell. The next morning, Christmas Day, the first thing they did was check the hearth. If a stone had been moved or overturned, it was a sign of illness. But if a stone was missing entirely, buried or vanished, the person who placed it was destined to die within 12 months.
Imagine the tension of that Christmas morning, kneeling in the cold ashes, praying your stone was exactly where you left it. For the unmarried women of the household, the stakes were equally high.
though the focus was on matrimony rather than mortality, although in Victorian folklore, the two were often uncomfortably linked. A popular yet terrifying ritual required a young woman to go alone into the garden at midnight on Christmas Eve and pick 12 sage leaves, one for each chime of the clock. This had to be done in perfect darkness, without a lantern. The belief was that as she picked the final leaf, the shadow of her future husband would appear beside her. However, if she was destined to die unmarried, she would not see a man, but a coffin. The sheer nerve required to walk out of a locked, safe house into the pitch-black winter garden, knowing that you might hallucinate your own funeral casket, speaks to a society that had a very different relationship with fear than we do. They courted it. They invited it into their rituals. There were even darker invitations. In the rural districts, away from the gas lamps of London, the old belief in the supper for the dead persisted. This was a solemn meal prepared and set out on Christmas Eve, with places laid for family members who had passed away. The living would sit in silence, the doors left unlocked, to allow the spirits entry. They would watch the empty chairs, straining their eyes in the gloom, looking for a depression in the cushion or the movement of a spoon. It was an act of supreme grief and terrifying hope. If the food was consumed, or if a wind swept through the room, it was taken as a sign that the dead were present. But the danger lay in who or what might accept the invitation. Folklore warned that if the grief of the living was too intense, it could anchor the spirit to the earth, preventing them from returning to their rest, or worse, it could invite a demon masquerading as the loved one, seeking to possess the house. This obsession with the supernatural on Christmas Eve extended to the animal kingdom as well. A pervasive legend, one that Thomas Hardy later immortalized, claimed that at the stroke of midnight, all cattle in the barns would fall to their knees in honor of the Nativity. It sounds like a pious, gentle image, yet the folklore carried a sting. It was forbidden for humans to watch. To spy on the kneeling beasts was a sacrilege that invited severe punishment. Stories circulated of skeptics who sneaked into the stables to witness the miracle, only to be found the next morning struck blind or wandering the fields in a state of permanent madness. The message was clear. There are mysteries on this holy night that belong to nature and to God, and human curiosity has a hard limit. Even the food they ate was codified with superstition. The Yule doughs, or Yule babies, little dolls made of pastry with currants for eyes, were baked and given to children.
But these were not just treats, they were effigies. In some regions, it was believed that if you kept the Yule dough unbroken throughout the 12 days of Christmas, you would have protection against evil spirits for the coming year. If it crumbled or was eaten by a mouse, the protection was shattered. Every action, from the cutting of the cake to the stirring of the pudding, was a negotiation with luck. The Christmas pudding itself was a divination tool loaded with tokens: a coin for wealth, a ring for marriage, a thimble for spinsterhood, a button for bachelorhood. When you took a bite, you were literally chewing on your destiny. As the night deepened and the candles burned low, the atmosphere in the Victorian home shifted from anticipation to a kind of siege mentality. They had told the stories, they had cast the runes, they had bolted the doors. Now, they simply had to endure the dark hours until dawn. The devil's knell may have rung, but the hours between midnight and sunrise were the witching hours in the truest sense. It was believed that on this night, the wild hunt, a spectral procession of phantom hounds and huntsmen, rode across the sky, gathering the souls of the unbaptized and the wicked. To hear the baying of the hounds above the wind was a death omen. And so the Victorians sat, listening to the roaring of the gale in the chimney, wondering if it was merely the weather or the sound of the hunt passing over their rooftop, deciding who to take and who to spare. This intense, claustrophobic focus on the supernatural was not a rejection of the Christian holiday, but a necessary counterpart to it. In the Victorian mind, the holiness of Christmas was so powerful that it naturally provoked a reaction from the forces of darkness. The brighter the light, the deeper the shadow. They understood to truly feel the relief of Christmas morning, one had to first survive the spiritual gauntlet of Christmas Eve. They needed the fear. It was the salt that gave the feast its flavor.
And as the clock ticked toward the early hours of the morning, the exhaustion would set in, a collective fatigue born of vigilance. But they would not sleep yet. There was still the matter of the first foot, the very first person to cross the threshold after the stroke of midnight, or in some traditions, on Christmas morning itself. The character of this visitor would determine the luck of the house for the entire year. A dark-haired man was lucky. A fair-haired man, or worse, a woman, was a disaster. Thus, even the simple act of opening the door to a neighbor became a loaded game of Russian roulette with the family's future. But this anxiety was not confined to the front door. While the head of the household watched the threshold with bated breath, waiting for that lucky dark-haired stranger, a different, more primal drama was unfolding in the stables and the fields.
The Victorian night was alive with a specific breed of folklore that suggested the boundary between the human world and the animal kingdom dissolved entirely at the stroke of midnight. It was widely whispered in the rural counties, from the damp fens of Cambridgeshire to the rocky coasts of Cornwall, that as Christmas Eve turned to Christmas Day, the natural order was briefly, miraculously suspended. But in true Victorian fashion, this miracle came with a terrible price for those foolish enough to witness it. The most pervasive legend claimed that at the exact moment of the Nativity, all cattle would rise from their sleep and kneel in their stalls in reverence. It sounds like a beautiful, pious image, the kind one might see on a gilded greeting card. However, the oral traditions of the 19th century attached a grim warning to this spectacle. No human eye was permitted to see it. To spy on the devotion of the beasts was an act of sacrilege. There are countless localized tales of the skeptical farmer or the arrogant stable hand who, fueled by cider and bravado, decided to hide in the hayloft to prove the superstition wrong. In these stories, the outcome is never benign. The voyeur is often found the next morning, struck blind, paralyzed, or dead, their face twisted in a rictus of terror, having seen something in the eyes of the oxen that the human mind was never meant to comprehend. Even more chilling was the belief that for 1 hour, animals were granted the power of speech. Again, the Victorian imagination twisted this miracle into a source of dread. If the beasts could speak, what would they say? They possessed the sight of the spirits. They saw the specters gathering in the corners of the barn that the farmer could not see. The legends warn that if you were unfortunate enough to overhear the cattle talking on Christmas Eve, you would almost certainly hear them discussing your own funeral. There is a specific recurring folktale from the West Country about a farm laborer who hid to listen to the oxen. The laborer, overcome with dread, died of shock before the sun rose, fulfilling the prophecy he was never meant to hear. The lesson was brutal and clear. The holy mysteries of the night belonged to the creation, not the masters of it. Inside the home, the atmosphere was equally charged with the potential for prophetic disaster. As the Yule log burned down, transitioning from a roaring blaze to a bed of glowing embers, it became a tool for divination. The shadows cast by the dying fire were scrutinized with obsessive paranoia. It was believed that if the firelight cast your shadow against the wall and that shadow appeared headless, you would not live to see the next Christmas.
Imagine the scene, a family gathered for warmth, the children drowsy, the elders telling tales, while secretly, every adult is glancing nervously at the wall, checking the silhouettes of their loved ones, praying to see the distinct outline of a head on every shoulder. It turned the hearth, the symbol of comfort, into a silent judge of mortality. This obsession with death omens on Christmas Eve speaks to the Victorian understanding of the holiday as a hinge in time. It was not merely a celebration, it was a transition point where the old year began to rot and the new year struggled to be born. In that gap, the laws of reality were porous. Mirrors, for instance, were often covered or turned to the wall in strictly traditional households. The fear was that if one looked into a mirror as the clock struck midnight, they would not see their own reflection, but the face of the devil standing behind them. Or worse, the face of their future corpse, aged and decayed. The vanity of checking one's appearance was risky when the spiritual barriers were down. In the mining districts of the North, the superstitions took on a subterranean darkness. Miners who spent their lives in the bowels of the earth had a profound respect for the knockers and spirits that dwelt in the dark. On Christmas Eve, it was strictly forbidden to descend into the pits. The belief was that the high spirits of the holy night agitated the demons of the deep earth. To work on this night was to invite a cave-in. Some legends claimed that if you put your ear to the ground near an old mine shaft at midnight, you could hear the sounds of a ghostly shift changing, the clinking of pickaxes and the rumble of spectral carts, performed by the souls of men who had died in the dark and were now eternally reenacting their labor. The silence of the industrial machinery above ground was contrasted by this phantom industry below, a reminder that the dead were never truly at rest, even on the holiest of nights. And let us not forget the bees. In the apiaries of the countryside, it was said that the bees would hum the 100th psalm at midnight. But unlike the cattle, the bees were considered safer mediators of the divine. Farmers would often go out to the hives, not to listen for words, but to wrap the hives in black crepe if a death had occurred in the family that year, or to leave a sprig of holly. It was a way of including the non-human elements of the homestead in the protection of the night. Because protection was needed, the darkness outside the circle of the Yule log's light was not empty. In many parishes, specifically in heavily folkloric counties like Yorkshire and Sussex, the church bells would not just ring for joy. For exactly 1 hour before midnight, the bells would toll a slow, mournful death knell. The theological idea was that the devil died when Christ was born, only to be revived later by the sins of the world. But the folklore suggests something more visceral.
They were ringing the bells to drive the darkness back, to create a sonic shield around the village. The tolling was heavy, rhythmic, and relentless, a pounding headache of sound designed to make the air uncomfortable for demons. But when the clock finally struck midnight, the rhythm would change instantly to a joyous peal. The transition from the death knell to the birth peal was the psychological climax of the night. It was the moment the tension broke. However, until that switch occurred, the listener lay in the dark, counting the heavy strokes, acutely aware that the old lad, the devil, was in his death throes, and a dying beast is often the most dangerous. This duality, the mingling of the sacred and the terrifying, was the heartbeat of the Victorian experience. They did not try to sanitize the night as we do. They did not drown out the silence with 24-hour television or electric lights that banish all shadows. They sat in the semi-darkness, listening to the wind, listening to the settling of the house, and telling stories that gave shape to their fears. And of all the stories told by the dying fire, few were as popular or as tragic as the tales of those who went missing on this night, those who were swallowed by the landscape itself. The lore of the mistletoe bough, a ballad that became a staple of Christmas Eve storytelling, perfectly encapsulates this domestic horror. It tells of a young bride playing hide-and-seek on her wedding day, often conflated with Christmas in the retelling, who hides in an old oak chest in the attic. The lid snaps shut, the lock catches, and she is unable to escape. Her family searches for her but never finds her. Years later, her skeleton is discovered in the chest, still wearing the wedding dress. While the story predates the era, the Victorians obsessed over it. They sang it in parlors across the empire. Why? Because it touched on the ultimate fear, that within the safety of the house, during a time of celebration, one could simply vanish into the dust. It reinforced the idea that tragedy was always waiting in the wings, even or especially when the halls were decked with holly. As the night deepened and the holy hour of midnight passed, the danger shifted. The immediate threat of the devil's presence receded with the ringing of the joyous bells, but the long, cold hours before dawn brought their own entities. The fire was now low, the room was cooling, and the exhaustion was setting in. This was the dead of night in the truest sense. In the lore of the era, the hours between 3 a.m. and dawn were not governed by the grand battles between good and evil, but by the mischievous, the strange, and the unclassifiable. The house was now vulnerable to the creeping things. It was in this heavy silence that the domestic spirits, the ones who lived in the wainscoting and beneath the floorboards, became most active.
We often forget that before the commercialization of Christmas elves, the Victorian home was believed to be inhabited by much older, more temperamental guardians. In the rural district, and even in the darker corners of London townhouses, there was a lingering belief in the hob, the brownie, or the lob lie by the fire. These were not the cheerful toy makers of modern greeting cards. They were transactional, territorial entities who demanded respect. On Christmas Eve, as the family retreated to their cold beds or kept their silent vigil by the dying embers, the lady of the house had one final, crucial obligation.
She had to leave a bowl of cream or a portion of the Christmas feast out on the hearth. This wasn't for Father Christmas. This was a bribe. The folklore dictated that if the household spirit was neglected on this holiest of nights, the consequences for the coming year would be dire. Milk would sour instantly in the pail, bread would refuse to rise, and livestock would fall mysteriously ill. The creeping things the Victorians feared weren't just demons from hell. They were the invisible tenants of their own homes, capable of turning domestic bliss into a living nightmare if the proper rituals weren't observed. But if the interior of the house held a quiet, transactional tension, the world outside the frosted window panes held a much more profound and dangerous mystery. There is perhaps no Victorian Christmas legend more pervasive nor more haunting than the belief regarding the beasts of the field. You have likely heard the charming version of this story, that at the stroke of midnight on Christmas Eve, in honor of the Nativity, the oxen kneel in their stalls and are granted the power of human speech. It is a beautiful image, one that poets like Thomas Hardy immortalized with a sense of wistful nostalgia. But in the raw oral tradition of the 19th century, this miracle was not a spectacle for human eyes or ears. It was a forbidden sacrament. The folklore was explicit. The animals did indeed speak, but they were not chatting about the weather or the quality of the hay. They were prophesying. And almost without exception, their prophecies concerned death. There is a recurring tale found in nearly every county of Victorian England, a cautionary legend told to suppress the curiosity of skeptics. It usually involves a farmhand, often named in the local dialect, who decides he does not believe in the old superstitions. Fueled perhaps by too much cider, or simply a rebellious nature, he resolves to hide in the stable on Christmas Eve to prove the old folks wrong. Picture him there, huddled in the damp straw, the smell of manure and beast sweat sick in the freezing air. He watches the breath of the horses pluming in the dark. He waits for midnight. The church bell in the distance begins to toll the hour, 12 strokes, and then the rustling stops. The heavy beasts, the oxen and the plow horses, slowly bend their knees, sinking to the straw with a collective, reverent sigh. The skeptic holds his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. Then, a low, guttural voice breaks the silence, not from a man, but from the stall of the oldest ox. "We have a heavy load to carry on Friday," the beast rumbles. From the next stall, a horse whinnies, the sound twisting into intelligible words. "Aye, to the churchyard." "We shall carry the master," the ox replies. The legend always ends the same way. The farmhand is found the next morning, catatonic with terror, or dead from a stopped heart. If he survives the night, he inevitably dies within the week, fulfilling the prophecy he was never meant to hear. This story served a vital purpose in the Victorian psyche. It drew a hard line between the sacred and the profane. It reinforced the idea that Christmas Eve was a time when the veil between the natural and supernatural was dissolved, but that did not mean humans were invited to cross it. The miracle belonged to the animals. The danger belonged to the listener. This fear of the natural world gaining sentience extended beyond the barn. In the apiaries and gardens, another ritual had to be performed as the night wore on toward the gray hours of the morning. The master of the house was expected to drape the beehives in black crepe or sprigs of holly and whisper the news of the nativity to the colony. If the bees were not told, they would stop producing honey, or worse, they would die en masse, taking the luck of the estate with them. Imagine the scene: a solitary figure in a heavy wool coat, trudging through the knee-deep snow at 3 in the morning, leaning close to a frozen wooden box to whisper prayers to sleeping insects. It seems absurd to the modern mind, but to the Victorian, it was a necessary insurance policy against the chaos of the universe. They lived in a world where a simple infection could kill a child in 3 days. They needed to believe that by following the correct script, by honoring the bees and the oxen and the hearth spirits, they could exert some control over their fragile existence. As the hours crept past 4 a.m., the dead of night began to wane, but the tension in the house did not dissipate. It merely changed texture. The fire would be nothing but gray ash by now. The cold would be penetrating, seeping through the brick and the plaster, chilling the occupants to the bone.
While often associated with New Year's Eve in the Scottish Hogmanay tradition, the anxiety about who or what would be the first to cross the threshold on Christmas morning was prevalent throughout the British Isles. The house had been sealed against the dark for 12 hours. The barrier had been absolute. Now, as the dawn approached, that seal would have to be broken.
The Victorians believed that the luck of the entire household for the coming year hung on the character of the first person to enter the door after the Holy Vigil. A dark-haired man was considered lucky. A fair-haired man or a woman of any coloring was often considered an omen of disaster. In some regions, it was considered incredibly dangerous to let anyone leave the house before someone had entered it. You could not give your luck away before you had received it. So they waited. The exhaustion was physical, a heavy weight pressing down on eyelids, but the adrenaline of superstition kept them alert. Every creak of the settling house sounded like a footstep. Every gust of wind rattling the sash window sounded like a knock. They were waiting for the light, but they were also waiting to see if they had survived the spiritual siege. The candles burned low in their sockets, the wax pooling and dripping onto the table linens. The winding sheets of wax that predicted mortality were checked one last time. If the flame burned blue, a spirit was passing. If it sputtered and died, a life would soon follow. They sat in the semi-darkness, surrounded by the remnants of the feast, the ghost stories and the unspoken fears, waiting for the first gray light to touch the eastern sky. This was the final stretch of the ordeal. The monsters of the midnight hour had retreated, the talking beasts had returned to their dumb silence, and the devil had missed his chance to claim a soul during the card game. But the night wasn't over. The Victorian Christmas Eve was an endurance test, a marathon of the spirit. They had looked into the dark, told stories to keep the terror at bay, and now, frozen and weary, they prayed that the sun would rise on a world that was still familiar. They needed the bells. They needed the sound that would finally break the spell and turn the haunted chamber back into a simple parlor. And then the silence shattered, not with a scream, but with iron. High above the frosted rooftops, in the stone throat of the parish tower, the great bells swung. The first peal cracked the heavy atmosphere of the parlor, vibrating through the glass of the windows and into the bones of those keeping the vigil. This was the sound that broke the spell. For an hour before midnight, the bells had tolled a funeral march, one stroke for every year since the birth of Christ, to mourn the death of the devil, who was said to perish exactly as the holy day began. The final stroke, ringing out at the stroke of midnight or just before dawn depending on the local custom, signified the triumph of light. The vibration seemed to scrub the air clean. The shadows, which had spent the last 12 hours stretching and morphing into spectral shapes, snapped back into mundane silhouettes of chairs, sideboards, and heavy drapes. The fire, now just a bed of glowing embers, was no longer a gateway for divination, but simply a source of dying heat.
The wax winding sheets on the candles were blown out, their prophecies either accepted or ignored in the face of the morning. The relief was physical, a collective exhale that loosened the knots in their chests. The threshold had been crossed, the longest night was over, and the sun, pale and watery, began to bleed through the heavy velvet curtains. They stepped out of their homes and into a world that looked deceptively innocent. The terror of the previous night was buried under a fresh layer of snow, the landscape white and silent, hiding the mud and the decay. As families walked to the morning service, their breath misting in the biting air, there was a profound sense of survival. They had faced the darkness, both the literal absence of light and the metaphorical darkness of their own mortality, and they had endured. This transition from the haunted, claustrophobic heat of the parlor to the crisp, sanctified air of the churchyard was the emotional climax of the holiday. The joy of Christmas Day was not a given, it was earned. It was the emotional payoff for the endurance test of the eve. The carols sung that morning possessed a fervor that modern listeners might find difficult to understand, a desperate, triumphant gratitude that the sun had indeed returned. But as the Victorian era ground slowly toward the 20th century, the shadows began to retreat, not just for the morning, but for good. The decline of the scary Christmas was not sudden, but it was inevitable. It was killed by the very progress the Victorians championed. Gaslighting and eventually electricity banished the flickering shadows from the corners of the room. When you can flood a parlor with steady, artificial light at the flip of a switch, the ambiguity required for a ghost story evaporates. The specter needs the semi-darkness. It needs the uncertain shape in the corner that might be a coat rack or might be a grandfather long dead. Electric light allows for no such errors of perception. It sterilized the domestic space, turning the haunted chamber back into a mere living room. Simultaneously, the cultural attitude toward death began to shift. In the early and mid-Victorian periods, death was a domestic affair, happening in the bedroom upstairs, with the body laid out in the parlor. By the turn of the century, death was moving into the hospital and the funeral home. It was becoming professionalized, sanitized, and removed from the daily rhythm of the household. As the physical presence of death receded from the home, the psychological need to confront it through ritual and story began to wane. The memento mori, the reminder that you will die, was replaced by a commercial imperative to be happy. The ghosts were evicted to make room for a more marketable, child-friendly magic. The terrifying, shape-shifting St. Nicholas and the punitive spirits were smoothed over, their rough edges sanded down until they became the jovial, harmless figures of the Coca-Cola age.
Yet something of that old, dark current remains, buried deep in the bedrock of the holiday. We may have sanitized the season, wrapping it in tinsel and electric lights, but the instinct to look into the dark persists. It survives in the enduring popularity of A Christmas Carol. While most adaptations focus on the redemption of Scrooge, the story itself is a quintessential Victorian horror, filled with wandering spirits, corpses, and the grim specter of a lonely death. We revisit it every year, not just for the moral lesson, but because, on some level, we crave the chill. We need the contrast. Just as a fire feels warmer when the wind is howling outside, the joy of the holiday feels sharper when it is edged with a sliver of fear. There is a reason why even today, when the wind rattles the window panes on a snowy December night, we feel a primal urge to gather closer together. The Victorians understood something that we have largely forgotten, that light and dark are not opposites to be separated, but partners in the same dance. They knew that to truly appreciate the sanctuary of the home, one must acknowledge the wilderness outside. To truly value the warmth of the living, one must invite the memory of the dead to the table, if only for one night. Their Christmas Eve was a holistic acceptance of the human condition, fear and joy, life and death, the cozy and the uncanny, all woven into a single, dense tapestry of experience. The ghost story, in its essence, was an act of defiance. It was a way to domesticate the terror, to trap the unknown in the structure of a narrative and control it. By telling these stories, by performing these divinations, the Victorians were not succumbing to fear, they were mastering it. They were inoculating themselves against the harsh realities of their time with a dose of recreational terror. So as we close the book on the Victorian Christmas Eve, we are left with a different picture than the one on the greeting cards. We see a holiday that was wilder, stranger, and far more intense than our own. We see a people who did not hide from the dark, but who invited it in, poured it a glass of wine, and asked it to speak. They understood that the ghost is not the enemy of the feast. The ghost is the guest that makes the feast matter. When you sit down this Christmas Eve, perhaps in the glow of a television or the steady hum of central heating, take a moment to turn off the lights. Let the room settle into the blue-gray ambiguity of the night. Listen to the wind. Look into the shadows in the corner of the room and try to see what they saw. You might find that the atmosphere changes. You might feel the air grow heavy and the silence grow thick.
And if you listen closely enough, past the noise of the modern world, you might just hear the faint, rhythmic scratching of a needle on a winding sheet, or the echo of a story whispered in the dark, reminding you that the barrier between the here and the hereafter is thinnest when the year is dying. The candles are out, the fire is low, the guests have gone. But in the silence of the Victorian Christmas, nothing is ever truly alone.